The worst 5 minutes of my life began with the doctor removing his glasses. People think tragedy announces itself with alarms and chaos. Sometimes it arrives in complete silence. I was sitting beneath fluorescent hospital lights at St. Joseph Medical Center when the doctor stepped into the hallway and called my name. Emily Carter. 3 simple words. 3 words that changed everything. I stood so quickly my chair nearly tipped over. My mother had been admitted 2 days earlier after weeks of pretending she was fine. That was her specialty. Smiling through pain. Telling everyone not to worry. Making impossible situations seem temporary. The doctor led me a few feet away from the waiting area before speaking. I remember the smell of disinfectant. The distant sound of rolling carts. The soft beeping of monitors somewhere behind closed doors. Every detail remains frozen in my memory. Your mother needs treatment soon, he said carefully. The condition is manageable, but delaying care could create serious complications. For one brief second, hope appeared. Then he explained the cost. The number hit me harder than any bad news before it. I stared at him, certain I had misunderstood. I worked 2 jobs. I paid rent. I barely managed groceries some weeks. The amount he mentioned belonged in someone else's life, not mine. There has to be another option, I whispered. The doctor looked genuinely sympathetic. That somehow made it worse. I wish there was. A few minutes later he walked away, leaving me alone in the hallway. My legs carried me toward a row of empty chairs without permission. I sat down. Then everything inside me collapsed. I lowered my head into my hands and tried not to cry. Tried and failed. Tears slipped through my fingers before I could stop them. I hated crying in public. Hated appearing weak. Hated feeling helpless most of all. Yet there I was. 27 years old. Sitting beneath cold hospital lights. Completely lost. People passed through the hallway. Nurses. Visitors. Doctors. Nobody stopped. I did not blame them. Hospitals were full of pain. Mine was not unique. Still, every passing footstep made me feel more invisible. Minutes blurred together. I stared at the floor tiles and wondered how I was supposed to save someone who had spent her entire life saving me. Then a pair of polished shoes stopped directly in front of me. At first, I assumed someone needed directions. I wiped my eyes quickly and looked up. The man standing there did not look like he belonged in a hospital hallway. Dark tailored suit. Expensive overcoat draped over one arm. Calm gray eyes that seemed to notice everything. He looked about 40. Confident without appearing arrogant. Powerful without saying a word. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he glanced toward the chair beside me. May I sit? The question surprised me. Most strangers would have offered sympathy and kept walking. This man was asking permission to stay. I nodded slowly. He sat down beside me without crowding my space. Silence settled between us. Not awkward silence. Patient silence. The kind that waits rather than demands. Finally he spoke. I have spent enough time in hospitals to recognize that expression. I looked at him. And what expression is that? His eyes remained on the hallway ahead. The one people have when they are carrying more than they can hold. For the first time that day, someone saw exactly how broken I felt. And somehow that frightened me even more than being alone. For several seconds I wished he would leave. Not because he had done anything wrong. Because the moment someone sees how much pain you are carrying, pretending becomes impossible. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor. The polished tiles reflected the harsh hospital lights above us. Nurses moved past. A wheelchair rolled somewhere down the corridor. Life continued around me while mine felt completely frozen. The stranger beside me did not rush to fill the silence. He simply sat there, waiting. Eventually, I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater and forced myself to speak. You do not even know me. His expression remained calm. No, then why stop? He looked toward the hallway before answering. Because everyone else kept walking. The answer caught me off guard. It was so simple that it sounded honest. I let out a quiet breath. Maybe they had somewhere to be. Maybe. And you do not? A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Not anywhere more important than this. I stared at him. Most people would have considered that a dramatic statement. Somehow, coming from him, it sounded like a fact. We sat in silence again. This time it felt slightly less uncomfortable. "You are not very good at ignoring people, are you?" I asked. The smile grew slightly. "Not when they are crying alone in a hospital." I laughed despite myself. It was a small laugh, the kind that escaped before permission was granted. For the first time all afternoon, my chest felt a little lighter. "There it is," he said quietly. "What?" "Proof you have not given up yet." I shook my head. "You got all that from one laugh?" I have learned to pay attention. The conversation should have ended there. Instead, it continued. Slowly, carefully, like two strangers crossing a fragile bridge. He never asked intrusive questions, never pushed for details. Yet somehow I found myself talking. Not about everything, just enough. I told him my mother was sick. I told him treatment costs were overwhelming. I told him I was trying to figure out how to solve a problem that felt impossible. He listened without interrupting. That alone felt unusual. Most people listen while preparing their next response. This man listened as if every word mattered. "You work?" he asked. "2 jobs. And you still came every day?" I looked at him. Of course I did. His eyes softened slightly. "Not everyone would." "She is my mother." The answer felt obvious. Yet he nodded as though I had explained something important. A doctor passed through the hallway carrying a chart. The stranger watched him disappear around the corner before speaking again. "My mother used to say that the strongest people are usually the ones nobody notices." I smiled faintly. "Your mother sounds wise." Something changed in his expression. Just for a second. A shadow. A memory. Then it disappeared. She was. The single word carried more weight than the entire conversation before it. I noticed it immediately. Whatever story stood behind those words, it was not a happy one. Yet I did not ask. Some wounds announce themselves even when nobody explains them. The silence returned once more. Comfortable now. Almost familiar. Then a voice called from the end of the hallway. "Mr. Moretti." A man in a dark suit approached quickly, carrying a tablet. He looked relieved to have found him. "We have been looking everywhere." The stranger sighed softly and stood. I looked up at him. Moretti. The name meant nothing to me. "Not yet. I should go," he said. For some reason, disappointment touched me unexpectedly. He noticed. "Emily." It was the first time he had said my name. "Yes." He held my gaze for a moment. "Whatever happens next, do not face it alone." Then he turned and walked away. I watched him disappear down the corridor beside the man in the suit. And for reasons I could not explain, I had the strange feeling that meeting him was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. The next morning felt unreal. I woke up after barely 3 hours of sleep and convinced myself the conversation in the hospital hallway had been nothing more than a strange moment between strangers. People cross paths every day. They shared a few words. Then life moved on. That was how the world worked. At least that was what I kept telling myself. By 7 o'clock, I was already at the diner where I worked breakfast shifts 3 mornings a week. Coffee machines hissed. Plates clattered. Customers filled booths beneath warm yellow lights. Normally, the familiar routine helped quiet my thoughts. Not that morning. Every time the front door opened, I found myself looking up. Every time a man in a dark suit walked past the windows, my attention followed him. It was ridiculous. I barely knew the stranger. I did not even know his first name. All I had was a last name. Moretti. Around noon, after my shift ended, I returned to the hospital carrying fresh clothes and a paperback novel for my mother. She smiled when she saw me. Somehow, even connected to monitors and surrounded by hospital equipment, she still looked more concerned about me than herself. "You look tired," she said immediately. "You look bossy," I replied. She laughed softly. The sound eased something inside me. For a while we talked. About ordinary things. Television shows. Neighbors. Books. We both pretended the future was less uncertain than it felt. Then she eventually drifted to sleep. I stepped back into the hallway and headed toward the hospital cafeteria. Halfway there, I noticed a television mounted near the waiting area. A news program was playing. I would have walked right past if one name had not caught my attention. Moretti. I stopped instantly. The screen displayed a photograph of the same man from yesterday. The same gray eyes. The same calm expression. The same expensive suit. Beneath the image appeared a headline. Adrian Moretti attends Chicago Development Summit. For several seconds I simply stared. Then another photograph appeared. Adrian standing beside city officials. Another beside executives. Another beside charitable organizations. My stomach tightened unexpectedly. I grabbed the nearest chair and sat down. Suddenly several things made sense. The confidence. The tailored clothes. The man in the suit who came looking for him. Adrian Moretti was not just some stranger passing through a hospital. He was one of the most influential businessmen in Chicago. Maybe even the entire state. I looked around the waiting area, almost expecting someone to tell me I had misunderstood. Nobody did. A nurse passing by noticed the screen. "Impressive guy," she said casually. "The foundation he runs helped fund part of the pediatric wing." I looked back at the television. "You know him?" "Not personally." She smiled. "Most people around here know the name." Then she continued down the hallway. I remained seated, trying to process everything. The realization created distance instantly. The kind of distance measured not in miles but in worlds. Men like Adrian Moretti lived in penthouses overlooking the city skyline. Women like me counted grocery coupons and worried about utility bills. We occupied completely different universes. The memory of our conversation suddenly felt impossible. Yet one detail continued bothering me. If Adrian was truly that important, why had he spent nearly an hour sitting beside a crying stranger? Why not leave like everyone else? Why stay? My thoughts followed me through the rest of the afternoon. Then, just before sunset, I returned to my mother's room. A nurse entered carrying paperwork. "Good news," she said with a smile. I blinked. "Good news. Some of the financial concerns connected to your mother's treatment have already been addressed." My heart stopped for a second. What does that mean? The nurse checked the chart. "It means several approvals came through much faster than expected." She smiled again and left. I stood frozen beside the hospital bed. Confused, hopeful, suspicious, and somewhere deep inside, a single name quietly surfaced again. Adrian Moretti. For the next several days, hope became something dangerous. Every morning I woke up wondering if the progress at the hospital was real or temporary. Every afternoon I expected someone to walk into my mother's room and explain there had been a mistake. Yet the mistake never came. Instead, more unexpected things happened. Paperwork moved faster than anyone anticipated. Appointments that normally required weeks of waiting suddenly opened. Questions that had seemed impossible started receiving answers. Nobody could explain why. Neither could I. One evening, after finishing my shift at the diner, I stopped by the hospital carrying a small container of homemade soup. The sky outside had already turned dark. The city lights shimmered through the windows while the familiar scent of disinfectant filled the corridors. My mother was asleep, so I quietly stepped back into the hallway. Near the nurse's station, I overheard two employees talking. "The foundation approved another grant this morning," one of them said. "That family does a lot for this hospital." The other nodded. "Especially Moretti." I froze for half a second. That name again. It seemed to follow me everywhere now. I continued walking, trying to ignore the growing suspicion in my mind. Coincidences happened. Hospitals received donations all the time. Important people supported important causes. None of that meant Adrian had anything to do with my situation. Still, the thought remained. Later that night, after visiting hours ended, I headed toward the parking garage. My feet ached from standing all day. My shoulders felt heavy. Exhaustion followed me like a shadow. Then I noticed a familiar black sedan parked near the entrance. My heart immediately betrayed me. The vehicle looked identical to the one I had seen on television interviews. Identical to the one standing behind Adrian in newspaper photographs. I told myself it could belong to anyone. Then the rear passenger door opened. Adrian stepped out. For a moment, neither of us moved. Surprise crossed his face first.
Genuine surprise.
"Emily." I stared at him. "You are here again." A faint smile appeared. "So are you." The answer made me laugh despite myself. The sound echoed softly through the nearly empty garage. Adrian looked exactly as I remembered. Dark coat, calm eyes, quiet confidence. Yet now that I knew who he was, everything felt different. The distance between us suddenly seemed much larger. I did not expect to see you, I admitted. Neither did I. He glanced toward the hospital elevators. How is your mother? The question was immediate. Not polite conversation. Not small talk. Genuine concern. Better, I said. At least I think so. Relief flickered across his expression. It was brief, but I saw it. That is good news. We stood there beneath the fluorescent lights while people passed through the garage carrying flowers, backpacks, and overnight bags. Finally, I looked directly at him. I know who you are. Adrian remained silent. Most of Chicago seems to know who you are. Another small smile appeared. That sounds unfortunate. You could have mentioned it. Would it have changed anything? The question caught me completely off guard. I opened my mouth and then closed it again. Because the truth was uncomfortable. Yes, it would have changed everything. I probably never would have spoken honestly in that hallway. Adrian studied my expression and seemed to understand. Exactly, he said quietly. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen but ignored it. For reasons I could not explain, that small action stayed with me. One of the busiest men in the city was standing in a hospital parking garage choosing to stay in a conversation with me. And for the first time I began to wonder whether our meeting had truly been an accident at all. After that night in the parking garage, pretending Adrian Moretti was just another stranger became impossible. Yet the strangest part was not his reputation. It was how normal he seemed whenever we spoke. The newspapers described him as powerful. The television described him as influential. The people around him treated him like someone who lived above ordinary concerns. But every conversation I had with Adrian felt surprisingly simple, human, real. 3 days later, I discovered just how different our worlds truly were. It happened on a Saturday afternoon. My mother had finally been moved into a more comfortable recovery room, and for the first time in weeks, she seemed genuinely hopeful. While she rested, I stepped outside the hospital to get fresh air. The autumn wind carried the scent of rain across the city. Leaves drifted along the sidewalk. For a few precious minutes, life felt manageable again. Then my phone rang. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. Normally, I ignored unknown callers. Something told me not to. Hello, Emily. The voice was immediately recognizable. I stopped walking. Adrian. I hope I am not interrupting anything. I laughed softly. You sound like someone asking permission to enter his own office. A brief chuckle came through the phone. That is probably fair. The conversation flowed naturally after that. Easier than either of us seemed willing to admit. Eventually, Adrian asked a simple question. Have you eaten lunch? I glanced toward a vending machine visible through the hospital entrance. Define lunch. That answer concerns me. I had coffee. Silence. Then, coffee is not lunch. It has been for years. Another pause followed. Emily. Yes. Come have lunch. The invitation caught me completely off guard. Every practical thought immediately objected. Adrian belonged to a world of private meetings, luxury offices, and people who wore expensive watches. I belonged to hospital waiting rooms and double shifts. Yet somehow, 30 minutes later, I found myself standing outside a glass skyscraper overlooking downtown Chicago. The lobby alone was larger than my entire apartment building. Polished marble floors reflected sunlight from enormous windows. Security personnel greeted Adrian by name the moment he entered. Employees nodded respectfully as we crossed the lobby. I felt completely out of place. Adrian noticed instantly. You are looking at the exits. There are a lot of exits. You are nervous. I work in a diner and a bookstore. I lowered my voice. This place probably has chairs worth more than my car. For the first time, Adrian laughed openly. The sound surprised both of us. That is probably true. Somehow, hearing him laugh made everything easier. He led me to a private dining area near the top of the building. The view stretched across Chicago in every direction. The lake shimmered beneath afternoon sunlight. Traffic moved like tiny streams of light far below. It was breathtaking. You see this every day? I asked quietly. Adrian stepped beside the window. Most days. I would never get any work done. Neither do I. I looked at him. That explains a lot. Another smile appeared. For the next hour we talked over lunch. Not about business. Not about wealth. Not about hospital bills. We talked about books. Favorite cities. Childhood memories. The things people reveal when they stop trying to impress each other. As the conversation continued, something unexpected happened. The distance I had imagined between us started shrinking. Not disappearing. Shrinking. Because behind the expensive suit and the famous name was the same man who had sat beside me in a hospital hallway when nobody else stopped. And somewhere between the city skyline and a conversation neither of us wanted to end, I realized the biggest difference between Adrian's world and mine was not money. It was that he had spent his entire life carrying responsibility alone, just like I had. The following week brought a kind of peace I had almost forgotten existed. My mother continued improving. The doctors sounded more optimistic. The constant fear that had lived in my chest for months finally loosened its grip. Yet something else had begun taking its place. Curiosity. The more time I spent around Adrian, the more questions I found myself asking. Not about his business. Not about his reputation. About him. One rainy evening, I arrived at the hospital later than usual. My diner shift had run long, and traffic downtown moved at a crawl. By the time I reached my mother's room, visiting hours were nearly over. She was asleep, so I quietly kissed her forehead and stepped back into the hallway. The hospital felt different at night. Quieter. Softer. The bright energy of daytime faded into something almost reflective. I walked toward the small coffee shop near the lobby and found an empty table beside the windows. Outside, rain streaked down the glass. Inside, the scent of coffee and disinfectant mixed together in a strangely familiar way. A few minutes later, Adrian appeared. I smiled before I could stop myself. He noticed immediately. "That seems like progress," he said as he sat down. "What is?" "The smile." I rolled my eyes. "Do not get used to it." Too late. We ordered coffee and settled into easy conversation. Then, for the first time since meeting him, I noticed something different. Adrian seemed distracted. Not visibly. Not enough for most people to recognize. But I had spent weeks learning his expressions. The small pauses. The moments when his eyes drifted elsewhere. The way his voice became quieter when something weighed on him. "What happened?" I asked. He looked up. "Nothing." That answer usually means something. A faint smile appeared, but it disappeared quickly. Silence followed. I expected him to change the subject. Instead, he stared out at the rain. "My mother died in a hospital." The words landed softly between us. Yet they carried enormous weight. I remained still. Adrian rarely spoke about himself. "How long ago?" I asked quietly. 12 years. He continued watching the rain. "Cancer." The single word explained more than an entire conversation could have. Suddenly, the hospital hallway where we met made sense. The way he recognized my expression. The way he stopped instead of walking away. The way he seemed to understand fear without needing an explanation. "I am sorry," I said. Adrian nodded once. So was I. His voice remained calm, but sadness lived beneath every word. "I spent months believing I could fix everything if I worked harder." He laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "Money, influence, connections. None of it mattered." I listened carefully. "You were there with her?" "Every day." He looked down at his coffee. "Until the last one." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The hospital around us seemed to fade into the background. Then I reached across the table and rested my hand gently over his. The gesture surprised both of us. Adrian looked at our hands and then at me. "You know," I said softly, "for someone who always rescues everyone else, you are not very good at letting people help you." Something shifted in his expression. Not pain. Not sadness. Recognition. As though nobody had ever said those words before. Outside, the rain continued falling against the windows. Inside, the distance between us became smaller than it had ever been. And for the first time since that day in the hallway, I realized Adrian had not stopped because he saw a stranger crying. He stopped because years earlier, he had once been the person sitting alone. The strongest people rarely break in front of strangers. They wait until they trust someone enough to let the cracks show. After our conversation in the hospital coffee shop, something changed between Adrian and me. Not dramatically, not all at once. It happened in small moments. Longer conversations. Fewer walls. More honesty. My mother continued recovering, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine a future beyond hospital corridors and medical bills. Adrian remained part of that future in ways I had stopped questioning. Then one evening everything shifted. I had just finished a late shift at the bookstore when my phone rang. Adrian's name appeared on the screen. Normally, he sounded composed no matter the situation. That night was different. "Emily," he said. His voice was calm, but something underneath it felt strained. "Are you busy?" I stepped outside into the cool evening air. "What happened?" A pause followed. "Nothing important." I immediately sighed. "You are becoming predictable." Another pause. "I am at the lake." "Which lake?" "Lake Michigan." I glanced toward the darkening sky. "Stay there." He sounded surprised. "You do not even know why I called." "I know enough." 40 minutes later, I found him sitting alone on a bench overlooking the water. The city lights shimmered across the shoreline behind him. Wind moved through the trees. Waves rolled steadily against the rocks below. Adrian stared toward the horizon as though searching for answers somewhere beyond it. I sat beside him without speaking. The silence lasted nearly a minute. Finally, he looked at me. "How did you know something was wrong?" "Because you called." A faint smile appeared and disappeared. "Fair point." We watched the water together. Then Adrian exhaled slowly. "Today would have been my mother's birthday." The words immediately explained everything. My chest tightened. I did not know. Most people do not. His eyes remained fixed on the dark water. "Usually I keep busy. Meetings. Projects. Travel. Anything that prevents me from thinking about it." He laughed softly. "Apparently that strategy is losing effectiveness." I listened carefully. No advice. No interruption. Just attention. The same gift he had given me months earlier. "Do you miss her?" I asked quietly. Adrian looked at me with an expression that almost broke my heart. "Every day." The answer came instantly. No hesitation. No performance. Just truth. Wind moved across the lake. Somewhere behind us, a train horn echoed through the city. Adrian lowered his gaze. "The strange thing is that everyone assumes grief gets smaller with time." He shook his head. "It does not. You simply become stronger at carrying it." I thought about those words. About the hospital hallway where we met. About the man who had sat beside a crying stranger, because he understood exactly what loneliness felt like. Then I gently touched his arm. "You know what I think?" He looked at me. "What?" "I think your mother would be proud of you." Adrian immediately looked away. The reaction surprised me. For a man who could stand in front of executives, politicians, and reporters without hesitation, those words affected him more than anything else. "Emily." His voice was quieter now. "You do not know that." "Actually, I do." He frowned slightly. I continued. "Because I know what kind of man stops for someone he has never met. I know what kind of man spends months helping people without asking for recognition. And I know what kind of man still carries love 12 years after loss." The wind seemed to disappear for a moment. Adrian stared at me. Then something remarkable happened. The weight he had been carrying all evening eased slightly. Not because the pain vanished. Because someone was finally helping him hold it. And sitting beside him beneath the city lights, I realized our roles had quietly changed. The man who rescued me in a hospital hallway no longer needed to be strong for both of us. For once I could be strong for him. Some truths arrive like thunder. Others arrive so quietly that you almost miss the moment your entire understanding changes. A week after our conversation by the lake, my mother was finally discharged from the hospital. Watching her walk through those front doors felt like witnessing a miracle. The autumn air was cool. Sunlight reflected off nearby windows. For the first time in months she looked lighter. Healthier. Hopeful. I should have been focused only on that moment. Instead, another question had begun following me everywhere. The hospital bills. The approvals. The sudden solutions that appeared exactly when we needed them most. Nobody ever explained how everything moved so quickly. Nobody ever gave me a clear answer. Then one afternoon I accidentally found one. I was helping my mother organize paperwork at her apartment when a sealed envelope slipped from a stack of documents and landed on the floor. I picked it up without thinking. Inside was a letter from a charitable foundation. At first I barely paid attention. Then I saw the signature at the bottom. Adrian Moretti. My heart stopped. I read the letter twice. Then a third time. The foundation had provided assistance months earlier. Quietly. Privately. Without publicity. Without recognition. Without telling me. I sat frozen at the kitchen table while sunlight stretched across the floor. Suddenly, every unexplained approval made sense. Every financial obstacle that had somehow disappeared. Every impossible break we had received. Adrian had been there the entire time. My mother noticed my expression. Emily. I looked up slowly. Did you know? Her eyes softened immediately. That answer alone told me everything. I found out a few weeks ago, she admitted. Why did you not tell me? Because he asked me not to. I stared at the letter again. Why would he do this? My mother smiled gently. Maybe because some people help others for the right reasons. That evening I called Adrian. Can we talk? I asked. Of course. An hour later we met at a quiet park overlooking the city skyline. The trees glowed with shades of gold and amber. Fallen leaves drifted across the walking paths. Adrian arrived wearing a dark coat, his expression calm as always. Yet the moment he saw my face he knew. You found out. It was not a question. I held up the letter. You paid for help through your foundation. Adrian looked at the paper before meeting my eyes. Not personally. Do not do that. He frowned slightly. Do what? Hide behind technical details. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Adrian sighed. I never wanted you to feel obligated to me. The honesty in his voice immediately weakened my frustration. Why did you not tell me? I asked quietly. Adrian glanced toward the skyline. Because the moment people know you help them, everything changes. I understood exactly what he meant. Gratitude becomes pressure. Kindness becomes debt. Relationships become transactions. Yet that was not what existed between us. You should have trusted me enough to decide that myself, I said softly. Adrian looked down. The silence that followed carried more emotion than any argument could. Finally he nodded once. You are right. The admission surprised me. Powerful men rarely apologized. Adrian did. Without excuses. Without pride. I stepped closer and folded the letter in half. Thank you, I whispered. His eyes met mine. For what? I smiled through gathering tears. For proving that the person I believed you were is actually real. And standing there beneath a sky painted with evening light, I realized the truth I had been avoiding for weeks. Somewhere between a hospital hallway and this moment, Adrian Moretti had become far more than the man who saved my family. He had become the person I trusted most. People often believe life changes in a single dramatic moment. Looking back, I think real change happens quietly. One conversation. One decision. One person choosing to stay when everyone else leaves. Nearly a year passed after the day I first met Adrian. Seasons changed. Snow covered the city and disappeared. Spring arrived. Summer followed. Life continued moving forward in ways I once thought impossible. My mother regained her strength. She returned to her garden. She started making plans again instead of preparing for worst-case scenarios. Every time I watched her laugh, I remembered how close I had come to losing hope. And every time I remembered that, I thought about Adrian. Some things between us never changed. We still talked for hours about books, family, and life. We still challenged each other when necessary. We still understood each other's silences better than most people understood words. Yet everything had changed too. Trust had grown into something deeper. Something neither of us felt the need to define. Then one autumn afternoon, I found myself standing in a place I never expected to revisit with peace in my heart. The same hospital hallway. The same polished floors. The same fluorescent lights. The same waiting area where everything began. I had accompanied my mother to a routine follow-up appointment. Nothing serious. Just another step forward. She was speaking with a nurse down the corridor when I stopped beside the row of chairs where I once sat crying. For a long moment I simply looked at them. I could still remember every detail from that day. The fear. The uncertainty. The feeling that the world had become too heavy to carry. Felt like another lifetime. You are thinking about it too, aren't you? Adrian's voice came from behind me. I turned and smiled. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. Some habits never changed. Maybe, I admitted. Adrian handed me one of the cups and glanced toward the chairs. You know, when I saw you sitting here, I almost kept walking. I stared at him. What? He nodded. I was late for a meeting. My phone would not stop ringing. I laughed softly. That sounds familiar. I took 3 steps past you. His expression grew thoughtful. Then I remembered how many times people walked past me when my mother was sick. The hallway seemed quieter suddenly. So you turned around? Yes. Adrian looked at me. Best decision I made that year. My heart tightened unexpectedly. Not from sadness. From gratitude. The kind that arrives when you finally understand how close life came to taking a different path. A nurse walked by pushing a cart. Somewhere nearby, a monitor beeped steadily. The ordinary sounds of a hospital surrounded us. Yet nothing felt painful anymore. My mother appeared at the end of the corridor and waved. She looked healthy, happy, strong. Adrian smiled when he saw her. She immediately smiled back. Watching them together always reminded me that kindness creates ripples far beyond the moment it begins. We started walking toward the exit. Sunlight poured through the front windows, bathing the lobby in warm golden light. Before stepping outside, I glanced back one final time. The hallway looked exactly the same. Yet it was completely different. Because I was different. Adrian noticed and gently touched my shoulder. Ready? He asked. I looked at the man who had entered my life during its darkest chapter. The man who taught me that strength and compassion could exist in the same person. The man who chose to stay. Then I smiled. More than ready. Together, we stepped into the afternoon sunlight. And for the first time, the future did not feel uncertain. It felt earned.